As you may already know, new regulatory requirements for combustible dust go into effect in January of 2027. So, from wood processing to manufacturing and food production, we are seeing combustible dust risk in a wide variety of industries. And our first webinar in this series walked through how to determine whether those upcoming regulations will apply to you. If you did miss that webinar, you can still watch it through the link that Jean will share for you in the chat. Today's webinar takes the next step, explaining what a combustible dust risk assessment could look like in your workplace. So by the end of this session, you should have a clear picture of how a dust risk assessment is conducted, what your role would be, and how you can prepare. Our presenter today is Alliance Safety Advisor and Occupational Hygienist, Martin Sheridan. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks, Jennifer. And welcome back to everyone to part two of the part two of three of this webinar series. As Jennifer mentioned, if you haven't seen part one, please go back and take a look. Feel free to take a look. We covered if the does the risk or does the DHA or the regulations apply to you and your facility. And as Jennifer mentioned today, we're going to go through what a defensible risk assessment actually looks like, and also touch on where do real risk assessments go wrong. So by the end of this presentation, you'll get to know what's involved in a DHA, who needs to be part of it at the facility, and what you can do to prepare for the DHA effectively. So in this webinar, we'll touch on specifically what makes an assessment defensible. What is due diligence and what does the qualified person mean? Common pitfalls and how to avoid them with the DHA process. We'll talk about scope, nodes, dust, ignition sources. And then we'll provide you with a step-by-step checklist that you can take away for your own DHA process. And so let's start with the first question, or the core question of today's presentation: what makes an assessment defensible? Before we get into that, we should probably talk about the different types of assessments or different flavors of DHA that could be conducted at your facility. So there are different ways of doing a DHA, and there's various benefits and drawbacks depending on each path. There's no single right method, and understanding the difference between them is important. So the purpose of this webinar is not to walk you through prescriptively of how each one is done, but rather to discuss how we're going to make each type defensible. So the first type that I'd like to just discuss is the prescriptive DHA, and that's where you might have a checklist or a detailed checklist, and it's prepared in advance. It's based off, let's say, NFPA 660, and it's difficult to veer off course. So you systematically go through this checklist one by one, answering the questions. It doesn't differentiate between risk, and the outcome may produce more controls as recommendations, so kind of blanket recommendations. So it's likely quicker to conduct this kind of assessment on the front end, but on the back end, it may be more costly because you end up with blanket facility-wide recommendations that might not be specifically tailored to the situation. The next type or next flavor is a risk-based combustible dust hazard assessment. And it assigns a risk rating based on likelihood and consequence. So it allows the facility who's doing this road or this method to prioritize actions and controls. So it'll produce a list of recommendations, some which are high risk or findings that are high risk, and then some that are lower risk. And so a facility can prioritize which ones to action first. It takes a bit longer to conduct, so it's a little bit more work on the front end, but the controls are tailored to the facility, and you can choose them based on the risk level associated, which ones to tackle first. Another flavor is what if. So that would be a set of realistic scenario-based questions for each node. So you could have a set of questions and you go node by node, and the questions could be like, what if loss of power? What if we have a seized bearing? What if we have foreign material entering in this stage of the process? And what if the operation was started without dust collection? Those are some examples of questions to ask, what if questions. And then another flavor, the final flavor, is has op. So this is one that uses keywords like too much, too little, no, reverse. You would answer what would be the outcome based on these keywords. So if we were looking at flow, for example, flow of ingredients or components through a process, what would too much flow look like? What would too little flow look like? What would no flow look like, or even reverse flow if something happened in the flow reversed? And these are ways of looking at the potential or identifying the hazards or the risks in your facility. So these are all valid types of assessments. The key is to choose one and then ensure that it's defensible. And that's what we want to talk about in this presentation. That brings us to the next slide. So what is defensible or defensibility? So defensible means a visible or a traceable chain of reasoning. So defensible doesn't mean necessarily that you have a fancy report, 300 pages, it looks flashy, but rather, do we have a traceable chain of reasoning? Do we describe what was assessed? What did we find and why? And a self-check that's useful could be if a stranger were to pick up that DHA report 2 years from now, someone that's not associated with the process, can they understand what's going on, where the hazards are, what was found, and clearly understand what they need to do to address those hazards or follow those recommendations? So this isn't just an opinion that we want to, it's a nice to have that our DHA is defensible. It's actually recognized in the DHA methodology. It's a reasoning standard that's recognized in NFP 660, and it frames how the dust hazard analysis flows. So it needs to be documented, it needs to be reviewed periodically, it needs to be led by someone who's qualified for the task, and we'll get to what that means later on. And that's the direction that the regulation points to, the one that's coming into effect in 2027. We want a traceable process. So who's actually qualified, and what does that even mean? Well, we'll talk about that in later slides today. So just to reiterate, the exercise of a dust hazard analysis is to exercise due diligence. It's not an exercise in just paperwork or checking boxes. It's to show that the evidence that you took reasonable or systematic steps. And one common pitfall or attractive chain of reasoning that isn't correct is that we've had no past incidents, therefore there's no risk. And we want to dispel that today. You can imagine that there's always no past incidents until it happens for the first time. So that's something that we will touch on later on. So a clean history usually means that the ignition source and the dust just simply haven't lined up yet. It isn't evidence that there is no hazard, and due diligence is demonstrated by the process being followed properly, assembling the right team for the DHA, discussing the scope, identifying gaps in your DHA, and not by putting blinders on and finding zero problems. So we'll talk about what a qualified person is in the next slide here. So what does the qualified person actually mean? So when it comes to DHA, there's no single fixed credential that covers the whole DHA process. Different tasks or different phases of the DHA require different expertise. So when you're selecting someone who's qualified, the main question is to ask what specific DHA experience do they bring to the table? So the person confirming the dust characteristics, or the person leading the node by node hazard identification, or the person signing off on explosion protection might all be different people. What matters is that it's documented and the relevant education and experience for combustible dust analysis is verified. So general OHS competence alone isn't automatically sufficient. So just because someone has a fancy designation doesn't mean that they've had experience assessing these kinds of hazards. So qualified people don't work in isolation, which brings us to the next slide here. So the DHA team. So a successful DHA is done with a team. So you might have, you'll have primary or fixed people on that team, and you might have as needed people on the team. So primary or fixed members of the team would be management, maintenance, operations or process, engineering, health and safety, if you have them, and then joint health and safety committee or worker safety representative. Those are all the key players that should be involved in the DHA process. Now we understand you might have multiple people wearing different hats, but in general, this is the key players involved. And you might bring in people to the team as needed. So you might have questions about fire or emergency response. So it might be good to reach out to, say, the local fire department or the emergency response team, depending on what kind of chemicals or issues you have at the facility. You might reach out to controls to answer questions. Housekeeping or janitorial, very important. They might see things that the rest of the group does not. So they're intimately interacting with the facility on a daily or weekly basis, whatever it is, and they might see accumulations that are just not part of the discussion. So really important to bring them in as needed. And you might have questions about equipment or machinery in your facility that might not be obvious. Like, what is the volume of this dust collector? What's the rotation of this equipment? So all this information or all these players might be brought in as needed, and there could be others that are brought in as needed. So why does consultation matter, and why do kickoff meetings matter? So a defensible assessment isn't produced in isolation by one qualified person and then handed over to the facility at the end, like, here's your report. BC's direction is pointing to a duty to consult the Joint Health and Safety Committee or Worker Health and Safety Representative on preparing the risk assessment itself, not just the resulting management program. So this isn't a courtesy step. And the reason for this is workers and supervisors know things that the assessor who's brought in cold can't see during their walkthrough. So they might know which bearing has been squealing, where things get actually dusty during upset conditions, where housekeeping struggles the most. And a kickoff meeting exists to set this up properly. So it introduces the process to the team. It explains what is in the scope, what is out of scope, and it opens the door for people to volunteer what they already know before the walkthrough, not after the walkthrough. So the kickoff meeting really sets up the whole process to succeed. And with that foundation, we'll talk about what can actually go wrong and derail the process. So common pitfalls that we see is, before even the DHA starts, is the team's not properly assembled or engaged. Information can be stuck in departmental silos, so departments aren't necessarily communicating with each other. Joint Health and Safety Committee consultation is treated as optional, and the kickoff meeting is either skipped or rushed. So these aren't hypothetical failure modes. They're basically process or organizational failures that happen before any technical analysis even starts. And the most common reason why a DHA ends up weaker than it looks on paper. So let's take these on one at a time, and starting with who's actually in the room. So the team problem. So we want to make sure that the team is engaged in the process. It's not just token attendance. Maintenance and operations are your best sources of information. A disengaged team means thinner judgment overall, but with the same looking report. So the report might look the same on paper, but it's not, it doesn't have much depth. So a DHA team needs to be more than just the OHS rep in the room. The core people need to be people that know how the day-to-day process runs, people who know the failure points, so maintenance, operations, people with process safety or engineering judgment. When maintenance or operations are pulled in reluctantly or treated as a formality, the assessment loses the best source of real-world information. And those are the people that actually open the panels, see what's going on inside the equipment and machinery. And this matters when we're talking about likelihood estimates or hazard scenarios that rely heavily on collective memory and experience of the people in the room rather than a disengaged or incomplete team. So even with the right people in the room, there's a second failure mode that sometimes doesn't get shared or addressed, and that's the silo problem. So you might have maintenance, they know everything about the bearing that keeps overheating, but operation knows that the process, or operations knows about the process upset condition that happens twice a shift, or housekeeping knows where dust actually accumulates, regardless of what the process flow diagram says. But none of this shows up in the DHA if these groups don't talk to each other, or if they only talk to the assessor that's been brought in separately and out of context. This is a structural problem of the DHA, and it's not that we have a bad actor or anyone that's trying to hide information. It's just that most facilities don't have a regular forum where these groups come together and discuss or compare notes about the ignition risk. And the DHA is often the first time where information gets consolidated at all. So the fix is in the information gathering phase. The walkthrough should deliberately draw out cross-departmental input and ask the group what they see, and they might see what others might not. So this is exactly why the consultation and kickoff pieces from a few moments ago aren't just optional extras or nice to have. They're an integral part of the DHA process. So for example, real world experience. So from a DHA we completed a few months back, the part of the DHA process is we ask about previous incidents related to fires or deflagrations, and that helps us hone in on problem points. It's not it's not accusatory, or we're not judging the facility. It's just those are high risk areas that we want to touch on. And so the facility that we're at, we're saying that they didn't have any issues related to fire or whatnot. But when we actually started doing the DHA, the operations was able to chime in that only a couple of weeks ago they had a smoldering incident where a bin that had aluminum fines or aluminum powder in it was waiting outside to be picked up, and it had rolled from underneath the shelter, and it was raining, and that aluminum dust reacted with the rain and started smoldering, and they had a smoldering event. And so that wouldn't have necessarily been captured by the person that we were liaising with at the start of the engagement. That information happened to be siloed and caught during the DHA process, and it was caught during the team meeting. So again, it just highlights the importance of having these discussions. Another example was a wood process facility that we were at that makes furniture, and everyone understood that there was wood dust that was being generated at the facility. When we started doing the walkthrough of the DHA, we found that on the chop saws, there was vinyl being cut, or plastic, and also aluminum as well as wood. And this was all being brought into the dust stream and the dust collector. And so there was a mixture of these components, which changes the properties of the dust that we were dealing with. So again, you might have great communication at a facility, but sometimes this information can be siloed, and it's important that a team approach is taken when doing the DHA process. So we've talked about the team, we've talked about the process pitfalls, and the common issues and some gaps. So now we'll talk about the scope. So it's important to define the scope at the get-go before you start the DHA process. And it's important that everyone agrees on what is being assessed. So we want to list what materials or what nodes are being assessed. And it's fine to have exclusions, but undocumented exclusions aren't okay. So If we decide to leave out a certain region because maybe the machinery is getting replaced, and we want to pick that up later at a later date, that's fine, but we just need to document our chain of reasoning. Again, it goes back to that defensibility. So a defensible scope means we've named what is included, what has been excluded, and why. And it also names the type of assessment that we're doing. Is this just a preliminary review? Is it a full DHA? Is it just an update of a previous existing DHA? Are we focusing on one area only? So again, as mentioned, exclusions are fine as long as we document why we excluded them from the scope. So here's what it looks like in an actual case. So another example, real world example, we were doing a DHA, and we were at a metals manufacturing facility. And in the middle of the DHA, we found another building that they had just moved into. They just acquired, and they were doing tenant improvements. And some of the manufacturing process was already live in that building. So that wasn't discussed in the original walkthrough, but we added that scope on the spot to include that building during the DHA process. So again, the scope matters. We want to talk about, we want to document what did we assess, why, and just make sure it's traceable. So once the scope is locked down, the next step is breaking the facility into reviewable pieces. So we've established which areas we're going to assess. Is it the whole facility? Is it just one area? But now we want to break it down even further. And so we break the process down into nodes of production. So a node is defined as part of the process. It's reviewed as a unit. It can include equipment, transfer points, collectors, building spaces. So in this image, you see the nodes have been split into raw material handling and milling as one node, and then another node, product handling and packaging. And they have similar equipment, but they also have different equipment, and they're treated differently in this example. So breaking things up into node by node chunks is what makes a large, complicated site actually reviewable instead of an overwhelming mountain or a blur. And it's what makes the report usable to the reader. A specific traceable finding per node instead of one vague statement about the facility. And nodes alone don't cover the whole risk picture. So we want to look at both equipment and building spaces. So not just the machinery or the process, but what's escaping the process. And as mentioned, I think we mentioned in the first webinar, that fugitive dust tends to be more finer and lighter. And it has been sitting there for a while, typically, and it's dried out. So it has different moisture content than processed dust. So we want to treat the building as its own node or its own part of the scope, and not just looking at equipment and then putting blinders on for the rest of the facility. So that brings us to the next set of questions, and this is what someone may ask when an assessor is looking at either nodes of the facility, so either equipment or machinery. So some questions, the 5 questions, these are pulled from, the first 4 questions were pulled from NFPA 660, and then we've added a 5th. So is there a combustible dust solid of sufficiently small particle size? Yes or no. So basically, do we have dust of a small particle size present in that area? Is there an oxidizer or air present in the atmosphere around that dust? Is there a competent ignition source? Is there a credible suspension mechanism to make that dust, to loft that dust into the air or suspend it? Or could a deflagration occur under confinement? So could we have an explosion situation where this is happening inside a vessel or a drum or a tank that's not designed to withstand the pressure and could lead to an explosion? So these are the questions that an assessor would go through node by node, identifying the hazard. So once we have a hazard identified, then this is what it would look like. This is a real node list from a DHA, where once we've identified the hazard in an area, and you can see that middle column talks about whether it's an explosion hazard or deflagration hazard based on the previous questions. Then we can assign a likelihood and consequence. And this is where it's not just professional judgment is involved, but also talking with the DHA team. So let's say operations says that we've had an issue with this piece of equipment, once every 2 years, such and such happens. Well, then we can figure out what the likelihood would be or estimate. And that helps feed into the risk assessment matrix that we see there in the bottom left. And with that kind of information, we can assign a risk level. Someone on the DHA team might have been working at the facility for 25 years, and they've never seen a certain process or incident happen. Well, that can feed into the likelihood risk matrix. It doesn't eliminate the risk, but it gives us a better calibration onto what's the likelihood of that occurring. And so you can see that in this DHA, we had different systems that we were assessing. In the middle of the table, we have the overall building itself as its own node. And then we have the risk level assigned from high to low in the last column there. So now that we've broken up the facility into pieces, we can talk about where the dust in each piece actually comes from and where it ends up. So as mentioned, there's different types of dust. There's processed dust, that's the dust that is actually in the process of whatever is being manufactured, and then there's the fugitive dust that escapes. So the question isn't, do I have combustible dust, or do we have combustible dust at our facility? We want to look at it through these different lenses. So is there dust that's generated? Yes or no? Is it part of the ingredients when we dump something into a hopper or we transfer it? Does the dust release or escape where it leaves containment? Is it leaking at a duct joint? Is it due to an overdue filter? Are we overfilling something? So we want to look at it through that lens. And then accumulation, that's where it settles and builds up on floors, beams, rafters, cable trays, equipment tops, inside enclosures. And then the last lens we want to look at it is there a suspension mechanism that can turn this settled dust back into an airborne cloud? So often compressed air is used for cleaning, and ironically, that compressed air can actually can spread the dust around rather than cleaning. So we want to look at that. Could there be vibration from falling equipment? If something tips over, could there be vibration to the building and dust? We have a raining dust cloud from the overhead beams. So a node can score low on for generation, but still be a risk if accumulation nearby is high. So that's why a node-to-node review is important rather than just one general facility-wide impression. So what does this look like when you're actually walking through your own facility? So a practical question would be, how much is too much dust? So we want to see, where is dust visible? Where does housekeeping struggle the most? And we want to compare accumulation to a defined threshold, not just a gut call. So we don't want to just kind of, put our finger into the air and try to figure out which way the wind's blowing and say, oh, this feels like too much dust, or this doesn't. We want to compare it, again, we want it to be defensible and compare it to actual standards, so to follow a chain of reasoning. So there are specific thresholds that have been provided by NFPA 660, which we'll cover in the next slide. And it's an example of how we determine whether we have too much dust. So one test here is you can see is someone's written the word dust in the surface dust on a piece of equipment. One test could be, is the underlying surface color obscured? So if you can't tell what the underlying surface color of a surface is, that's an indication that there's too much dust in general. So this is from NFPA 660, where they outline different criteria for different sectors of manufacturing. And so agricultural and food processing, there's an allowable 1/8 thickness of accumulated dust over 5% of the floor space. So once we have overhead rafters that are covered in dust, that's already at 5% or more of the dust space, or sorry, of the floor space. So that's a good indication. Are we above or below? For metals, there's no threshold level criteria. Basically, if that previous slide that we saw, if we see that the surface has dust on it, if we can visibly see it, that's already too much, according to NFPA 660. Wood facilities can have up to 1/8 of an inch over 100% of the floor space. So this has all been established through studies and research, and it's been published. So as I mentioned, that dust test where the color of a surface may be obscured, that might be a good rule of thumb, because no one's going to get a measurement or a ruler out and try to measure the difference between 1/8 and 1/32 of a millimeter when we're talking about dust. Very hard to distinguish that, especially when we've got different accumulations all over the facility. So the test of the coverage on a surface obscuring the color is a good metric to follow. And then we also want to review not just the dust accumulations, but also common ignition sources. So I'm not going to go through all of them here, but we want to, because we're not going to go through, this is not an ignition source control course. There are courses on that. But we want to understand what ignition sources are nearby that are credible, especially from wearing equipment that can seize up, electrical equipment that's not rated for a dusty environment, static discharge, especially when we have fine dry powders that we need to transfer. Is there any hot work or open flame nearby? And this matters more than the list itself. So looking at the credibility of the ignition source itself. So the question is not could there be a spark, but it's more so is it credible here with this dust? So BC's proposed directions builds on the specific concept around a competent ignition source, meaning is it genuinely sufficient to ignite that particular dust, and the anticipated approach would be straightforward. So if yes, then you would remove that ignition source, and if you can't remove that ignition source, you would control it. So before any of this can happen, you need to hand your assessor the right information from the beginning. And so what information would you collect before DHA? Information would include SDSs, any prior DHA reports, process diagrams, equipment lists, dust collector info, so maybe the manuals on the dust collector, housekeeping or maintenance records, incident history, we talked about that earlier, hot work procedures, what do they look like? Do they even exist? Electrical classification, and floor plans. So this might look like a daunting list, but there's some good news when it comes to this, is that this is just to get us a good head start and hit the ground running when we're doing the DHA. But if we don't have all the information, that's okay as well. Missing information doesn't stop the assessment process. They're identified as gaps, and they're documented as assumptions or follow-up actions. So defensibility comes from the transparency of these gaps, not the absence of gaps. So making sure we record that, hey, we talked about this, but we're missing this information. It's going to take us a bit to track it down. That's fine. It can come as a recommendation in final DHA report, or we can find it during the DHA process. But as long as we're documenting it and we're acknowledging it and being honest about it, that's what defensible means. And that transparency is really what separates weak documentation from strong documentation. So we want to make sure that the DHA is fit for the purpose. It's clear. So fit for purpose means it fits the scope. The participants, what was reviewed. We want to make sure that we document what was reviewed. We want to document where dust is, where it accumulates, what are the credible scenarios and safeguards. We want to document any assumptions that we made, any risk rationale, any recommendations, and we want to have action tracking. So if there are any actions that we need to take, we want to track them and document those as well. Assumptions could be that, hey, we didn't want to go through a screening test. We know that it's, we're dealing with starch, for example, or flour. We know that it's combustible. So we're going to skip the screening test and we're going to go right into the DHA. That assumption would need to be documented. So good enough documentation doesn't mean that it's minimal documentation. It means that it's fit for the purpose. It matches the scope, it's clear, and it's traceable. So let's discuss what the difference between a weak and strong finding would be. So an example of a weak finding would be dust was observed near cutting equipment. A stronger finding would name the equipment, would discuss the risk, what was unconfirmed, what do we not know about it, and what specific action do we need to take. So this weak version just names a symptom, and the stronger version names specific equipment, for example, a dust collector or some kind of energetic cutting process like a chop saw, explains why it matters, states plainly why it wasn't confirmed at the time, might talk about spark detection or suppression status, and give specific or actionable recommendations. So neither strong examples use hedging language or vague adjectives. They're specific enough that 6 months later, someone could act on them without trying to call someone to ask, what did this finding mean? It should stand alone. And then one more thing, again, to call out directly, and it's the most common excuse for skipping a node, for example, or not drilling down on a node, and that's no past incidents. So we know that this area is safe. We don't need to really drill down on it. So that means there's no risk. So a clean incident history doesn't mean that there's evidence of low risk. I just want to reiterate that. So the mills that experienced combustible dust incidents here in BC in 2012, they didn't have prior incidents before they experienced their incidents, unfortunately. So we just want to make sure that this point is drilled home, because it comes up quite a lot during DHA investigations. And if you haven't had an incident, that's great. We can fold that into the likelihood evaluation, but it shouldn't substitute the risk level itself. It can feed into the risk assessment, but it shouldn't substitute the risk level itself. So let's turn, we're going to wrap this up here. So let's turn this into something that you can action this week. So practical next steps. This is a checklist kind of version of what we covered today. If in part one you got yes, this does apply to us. We do have combustible dust hazard present, and this list gets you from that point to a defensible assessment. So the team assembly is called out explicitly, given what we've is called out explicitly, and none of these steps require already being a DHA expert. It just requires organizing information and being honest about what you know and what you don't know. So we want to confirm whether there's, we talked about step one. We want to identify dusty materials, obtain SDS test data, SDSs or test data. Some of the newer SDSs are now including test data on their SDS sheet, which is great, so that you don't have to guess. That data has already been provided to you. But again, you want to make sure that you're not just relying on the SDS test results if the dust is being changed or modified in any way during the production process. So it's a good starting point, SDSs, but they're not a be-all, end-all. Map where the dust is generated. So walk the facility, look for accumulation, look overhead, include overhead. Assemble the right team early. So ops, maintenance, safety, JHSC. Hold a proper kickoff meeting before the walkthrough. This is important. I can't drive this home enough. It sets up the whole process for success or failure. Gather procedures, work procedures, records, layouts, maintenance information. Review ignition sources and existing controls. Do you already have explosion vents? Do you already have spark detection? This is important information to gather on the front end. And then document unknowns honestly. If you don't know something, that's fine. Just document it so we can circle back to it and try to find out. Engage a qualified help for a specific task. So again, confirm their relevant DHA experience, and then build an action tracker after the assessment. So one more thing before we close, just want to go over what's expected at this stage. So right now, before the regulations come in, should be the scoping stage, the screening stage, whether the combustible dust hazard applies to your facility, gathering info, we just talked about that on the previous slide, and starting to engage qualified help. Not yet would be having a full polished management program or all your engineering controls in place. That's putting the cart before the horse, unless you've already done your DHA and you've got documentation. But now is really the time to start the grassroots steps. So let's wrap up with what we went over today. So we talked about defensibility, what makes a DHA defensible. We talked about a documented chain of reasoning, what is real due diligence. We talked about qualified person, and then it's not necessarily one person, it's task specific. We also want to ask what qualities or what experience does this person bring to the DHA team. The most DHA failures happen before the analysis even starts. So we talked about not having an engaged team, information siloed between departments, skipping the kickoff, or treating it as optional. We talked about that the DHA is a team effort from day one. I want to include your JHSC or worker safety rep from the get-go. We want to consult with them and bring them in on this process. When you're doing the DHA, we want to focus not just on equipment, we want to focus on building spaces as well. And another important point I want to call out, again, unknowns are okay. That's totally fine. But we just want to make sure that we're documenting them and not ignoring them or skipping over them. And again, lastly, no past incidents is not evidence of low risk. So what's up next in this webinar series? So part 3 in the series that's coming up next would be turning findings into a working management program, prioritizing recommendations, an action tracker, and then we discuss housekeeping, inspection, training, and management of change. So that is it for the presentation. We've got about 15 minutes here for questions. So we'll open it up to for questions.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Martin. A lot of information there, and we do have questions coming through. For anyone who still has questions, feel free to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to ask them, and we will get through as many as we can before noon today. So, Martin, the first question that we have from the audience, earlier in the presentation, you were sharing some examples of how it's gone wrong, how the DHA process has gone wrong for some companies. And this person was commenting that many companies are beginning to go digital with shared access to documents. And the question is whether a more collaborative approach to documentation and documentation management could potentially resolve or reduce the risk of silos if it's presented correctly.
Yeah, that's a good question. It definitely goes a long way. Sharing information, but I want to caution to think that having a shared folder solves the problem, because it's just like having a program document that sits on a shelf collecting dust. If there isn't a forum to connect people and discuss what is being shared, then it just sits in a folder. But I think it's a great tool for sure. It speeds up the process. Everyone can find everything in one location. So it's definitely a good tool, but I wouldn't say it's the final solution.
Makes sense. Yeah, and even in a team meeting, I could see where it could be helpful for reference together to go through those pieces. Good. Is the list of materials, so you shared some information from the NFPA standard. The question is whether that list was exhaustive. One of the attendees today works in the plastics industry and is wondering if plastic dust would then fall under general or if there are more categories.
That's a great question. So those are the current categories. So there's the agricultural, wood, metals, So those are three. And there's sulfur has its own category, and then there's other, which is kind of a catch-all. And so right now, that's where that would live. It doesn't mean that because it's in the catch-all category, the requirements are any weaker, or they're just, you could imagine, to your point, there's so many different categories of dust, and that's that general category that applies to all
Yeah,
dust.
absolutely. Good. Again, so from the plastics perspective, but I think this question applies really to anyone. As a plastic manufacturing plant, how often do we need to conduct a DHA based on the NFPA standard?
That's a great question. So right now, the standard points to um, at least every 5 years to revisit it. But when you have a significant change in process or procedure, then it would be incumbent to revisit that. Let's say that there's been equipment that's been removed, or you have a new piece of equipment. You've totally changed the process. You've changed the product line. You've changed the ingredients that go into that, or components. These are all reasons why you'd want to reevaluate that DHA. So the
Yeah.
DHA is a living document, basically.
That makes a lot of sense. Um, so what criteria, and I think you've kind of covered this in the first one, but if you could do a quick review of what criteria determine whether or not a workplace requires a DHA for combustible dust. Is there a short
So
answer to that?
yeah, so basically, I would point to those 5 questions that were in the presentation. So do we have dust? Do we have an oxidizer? So basically, the explosion pentagon. And so, do we have dust? Do we have an oxidizer? Do we have a way to do we have a way to ignite it? Do we have a way to make it airborne? And then could it be contained and lead to an explosion? So asking those questions would be part of the screening process. And then, as we talked about previously, to go a step further, go, no go testing at a laboratory will tell you definitively about your specific dust. Because you might have a mixture, you might have something that isn't well known. So those are some tools to determine whether it applies to your facility.
Terrific. And is a dust hazard analysis and a combustible dust assessment, are those two things interchangeable? And if so, why does WorkSafe BC call it a combustible dust assessment when the NFPA refers to it as a DHA? And if not, what's the difference between the two?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have the full answer to that. That might be a question for WorkSafe BC. But yes, they seem to be used interchangeably. But I can't verify. There might be a reasoning why it's being called that, but I'd have to look into that myself. It's a good question.
Okay, but essentially, we're talking about the same process.
In my estimation, yeah, it's the same thing.
Okay. Is there any change in the risk assessment or DHA process steps for lower risk industries such as healthcare facilities, for instance?
Sorry, what was the first part of that question? Is there any?
Is there any change in the process steps that you would go through to complete the risk assessment or for those lower risk industries? Or is it just a matter of whether you have to do it or not?
Yeah, I would say the first step is the screening step. So does it apply to that facility? You may not even have dust at a healthcare facility.
Right.
And then maybe the dust is just, limited to one node, where you don't have a 300-page document. You just have that node that's being assessed. So it wouldn't change the steps that you would follow, but it might change the volume of work involved.
Yeah, I would imagine be a pretty significant difference. Okay. Would a combustible dust explosibility test to report be beneficial and recommended?
So that depends on what you're looking for. So if you're looking for whether it's combustible or not, that could be a screening test, and then the explosibility tests will help design controls. So if you need it'll help, if you need explosion vents, for example, or you need some kind of isolation gates, what spec do they need to be designed to? So how much pressure do they need to withstand? So it's answering a little bit of a different question, not necessarily whether you have combustible dust or not, but what spec do controls need to meet based on the explosibility of that dust.
And that's determined in the standard or in the regulation potentially.
Yes, there's different types of analysis that you can do. So labs can help walk through that. And typically, when you go through a DHA, the outcome will be a recommendation for different types of testing. And so the qualified person could be able to walk you through that as well.
Okay, okay. So another question from the plastics manufacturing plant or a plastics manufacturing plant. Um, okay, well, I think you've already covered this on the frequency of how often you need to conduct a DHA. Um, but the next question is from an attendee today who had a consultant do a DHA for their organization. And part of the recommendations was to complete their own risk assessment um, of areas, equipments, processes. And they're wondering, isn't the risk assessment usually part of the DHA?
That's a good question. And while I can't speak to that specific scenario, what kind of undertook there, we do have different flavors of DHA as we talked about at the very beginning, and they might not include a risk assessment. So if you're doing a prescriptive checklist type, um, then they might tack on a risk assessment as a recommendation at the end to help you prioritize which controls. So it's kind of a mixture of two. I can't comment on what they did, but that might be the reason for it.
Okay, okay. Terrific. Martin, I think we're at the end of our questions, unless there are any last minute doozies from the audience, but I think you've made it through to the end, and we are just about out of time anyway. So, very much thank you, Martin, for your presentation and for putting this together for our audience today. Lots of really good stuff. Looking forward to part 3 as well. Uh, and just a few announcements quickly before we close. Want to invite you to join us next month for a new webinar with Technical Safety BC on ammonia risk and refrigeration systems. So definitely for anybody in food processing or other areas that use refrigeration, drawing on their analysis of ammonia leak incidents from across the province. So you can register for that session today through the link in the chat. And if you work in the brewery, bakery, or grain milling industries, please join us for our summer Industry Safety Council meetings, one coming up on July 28th for breweries, and on August 25th for bakeries and milling companies. And again, we'll share those registration links in the chat and in the follow-up email with all of you. A quick note that July 31st is the advanced registration deadline for Make It Safe Vancouver. I can't believe I'm saying that already. But tickets are half price when you book your seats this month. So great opportunity to get a great deal on your safety training and professional development. Really encourage you to join us this fall. And thank you again to everyone for joining us today. Watch for an email with a link to the recording of this webinar. Please share your feedback and topic ideas in the survey as you leave. And if you are looking for a copy of the presentation, please email us at manufacturing@safetyalliancebc.ca. And we look forward to hearing from you. And thank you all. Have a fantastic rest of your day.